Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 561, Satirizing History. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am well. I have had a whole week without work and have accomplished very little. I have been moving slowly. You know, it's that paradox of when you are very busy, you can get an awful lot done. And when you are not so much the busy, you are not so much the efficient at getting things done. But I have made some headway with the basement and organizing it in a way that it resembles the deck of the Enterprise. In that from a place, a single place where one spends most of one's time, one can reach everything one needs in order to do what one wants to do. So I have a desk space with the computer, but the computer is also the place where I get tutorials or watch how-to videos or take classes. And so I also need to have access at that desk to certain things. I also have a big folding table that we put out in the room for larger art things and like a cutting mat for fabric, things like that. So that's a different set of I need to be able to reach things in order to be efficient area. And, you know, figuring out how to orchestrate that in a basement with no walls upon which anything can be hung, because it's just cinder block. It's not a finished basement. It makes things interesting. So trying to be creative in the ways of the organizing has been the bulk of my week. Big congratulations to my mom, who is actually, she has said it out loud and in front of other people. She's retiring. Nobody actually believes this, but she's retiring enough that she'll be able to go to Ireland with us this fall, which I'm very excited about. On my previous work front, I don't know if you saw the news report. Listener Carmen, who comes to Thursday night chats, who always has the best books to share. In fact, I need to share with you the name of the book she mentioned last night, which is The Postscript Murders by Ellie Griffiths. This will be my next foray, I think, into fun after I finish. I've finished Amelia Peabody, so of course I'm in mourning. I read all of them, all of them. I'm heartbroken that there aren't more because I'm greedy. I've switched to Vicky Bliss, which the first Vicky Bliss book I could have easily skipped. The second one got better. The third one is considerably better. I am probably going to finish them all just because I can. I've been using Hoopla to listen to audiobooks for free and have been lucky because they have had all the ones that I've wanted so far. However, Carmen last night shared the fact that in Florida, there was in the news a particular office that had COVID sweep through. And it was a very telling and very unfortunate experiment in masking and vaccinations. And if you didn't see the news report, it goes something like this. One guy in the IT department caught COVID from someone outside of the office, from, I think it was actually from a different county, brought it back with him, infected several people in the IT department, 2 of whom died rather rapidly, 3 of whom were very sick. 1 or all of them may have been hospitalized. Once they started showing symptoms, they stopped coming to work. Now, once you start showing symptoms, you've been infectious for at least 2 days. This is what makes this whole disease so insidious, is that you're spreading it before you know you have it. Plus, of course, there's the problem with people being asymptomatic carriers, like Typhoid Mary was an asymptomatic carrier of typhoid. So here, the thing that was most important was that as the disease went from person to person within this IT department, eventually it got to the one person in the IT department who was vaccinated, and it stopped there, and nobody else in the office got it. This is what stops mutations from happening. Whether the barrier to transmission is our behavior, because we are wearing a mask, washing our hands, staying at least 6 feet away from people who aren't wearing masks, or whether the barrier is your body is carrying antibodies because you got a vaccine. Either way, stopping the transmission is what stops mutations from happening. So until people are all vaccinated or all learn to behave themselves, the longer transmissions go on for, the more variants we will get. And every time there's a new variant, there is the risk of that variant having some minor property change that starts the whole thing over again. Just like making a cassette tape copy. We were talking about this last night too. Just like making a cassette tape copy in the old days. If you got a mixtape and you made a copy of that mixtape for a friend, and then that friend made a copy of the mixtape for their friend, each time you copy it, you introduce the opportunity for there to be some amount of degradation, some amount of change in the quality of the audio. It is the same for cells, for viruses, for anything that replicates itself. Every time it replicates, there is the possibility of a chance change. And the worst case scenario is that we wind up with a variant that truly is more dangerous and that the vaccines don't work well enough against. Another reminder, the vaccine does not mean you will not get COVID. Just like getting a flu shot does not mean you will not get the flu. What it does mean is that you won't die. What a flu shot means is you won't wind up like I did, very nearly hospitalized with really bad pneumonia. You will merely feel lousy for a few days, but it won't kill you. And that's our goal. We know the disease is going to spread. There is no 100% solution to not spreading it. We want to limit the spread. We want to keep you from dying. So if you haven't gotten a vaccine yet, please, please, please find a list to get on, find a place you can go to. If you are in the States, go to another state if you have to. I certainly had to at the time because Pennsylvania was very slow with its rollout. I know that there are plenty of countries right now that don't have easy access to vaccines, and people are doing everything they can to rectify that situation as well. I believe Biden spent a bunch of money on vaccines that are being shared with other countries, and I hope they get to you as soon as possible. But boy, get yourself on a list. If you can't get the vaccine yet, at least find a way to do that, because I don't want to hear sad stories about anyone who listens to the podcast. That would make me very sad. But on to happier things, like Northanger Abbey. Although it is the end of Northanger Abbey, I do have a surprise for you at the end of listening to the chapters today. So I at least can hold that carrot out for you, even though we are ending this marvelous and fun book. Some things to know. Most of what I have for you today comes after, not surprisingly. But before we start the chapters, a couple of things to know. We ended our previous section with Catherine being home. She is not a particularly happy camper, but she is at least home and safe. Her mother is going to mention the Mirror. The Mirror was the name of a periodical that was circulating at the time, and she is actually referring to a real, well, most likely referring to a real article that was a fictitious letter, not a satiric one. It comes across as being kind of satiric to me, but it is a fictitious letter that was written in 1779 from John Homespun. That's how you know it's fictitious. And the title of it was The Consequence to Little Folks of Intimacy with Great Ones. And it's all about how it's not so good for the poor relations to go and spend some time with the wealthy relations because you get some highfalutin ideas about things. And he goes on to say a month of staying with a great lady had corrupted his daughters, inspiring dissipated habits, use of fashionable French terms, this is where it gets funny, religious doubts, and a general contempt for the humble means and customs of their own family. It's hard to tell from that the fashionable French terms if this was completely tongue-in-cheek or if it was really a complaint. It could have been either one. I haven't been able to find a copy of it. But that is what Mrs. Morland will be referring to. You'll hear the word uncandid. Uncandid doesn't mean in this case what we would think it to mean. In this case, uncandid means unfriendly or unfavorable, not dishonest. Or, when you're being candid, you're being open, you're being honest. This is a little bit different. So when you hear uncandid, think unfriendly. You will hear Jane Austen using the word sinking. And I am finding no references to that term being used as a known form of slang at the time. I cannot imagine that it's not a slang term, or it's at least a term that's being used in a slangy fashion. The phrase that you'll hear it used in is sinking half the children, which is pretty much exactly what it might bring to mind. That if you were, for example, to throw a bunch of children in a bag and throw them overboard with a brick in there, it's a horrifying idea. It's a horrifying term. It is not being used as a real statement. It is a horrifying metaphor for eliminating half the children from a story or from a conversation that you're having. You just throw them out of the boat. You're not going to pay any attention to them. They don't exist. The way Jane Austen uses it and the context in which she uses the term is very funny, I think, because of who is saying it and how appalling the statement is. I cannot believe that Jane Austen is not using that as a slang term coming out of this person's mouth. A term that I have not come across before, rhodomontade, which means being overly braggadocious, saying all sorts of awesome things about yourself, is a rhodomontade. It's RHODOMONTADE. Marvelous word. I'm going to have to try and find ways to work that into conversation casually. Necessitous is what it sounds like. It's just being needy. It's just used kind of oddly in a sentence, and it stuck out at me. So necessitous is needy. Forward is being pushy or presumptuous. And then we have a couple of situational complexities. When two young people of means got married, we know that there's this whole thing about how much money the girl is bringing to the relationship, how much money the guy is bringing to the relationship. For the woman, it's her dowry. One of the things that conscientious fathers of means would have done as well would be to have established, okay, there's this much money. Of that principle, this is how much they are going to be expected to live on. And of that principle, this is how it will be divided amongst the children that are expected to appear. So someone who is a second son, for example, like in our case, we know that would be Henry Tilney, a second son would be expected in a well-to-do family, would be expected to have a certain amount of money that is contractually available to him upon marriage, because that would have been set up actually by the kid's grandfather. So General Tilney wouldn't have been the one to have made that decision. That contract would have been settled by his father and his father-in-law upon his marriage to Mrs. Tilney. I don't think we've ever had a story in all these 15 years where that was dealt with up front quite so clearly as it is. Well, it's as clearly as it's alluded to here. So I thought that was kind of interesting too, because I've always wondered about that. And it also means that since it was stipulated by General Tilney's marriage contract, basically, it's not something that he can change or alter. Just like we've had situations where there's an entailment on the property and there's nothing that can be done about it. A quick reminder about peerage and rankings. The fifth and last of the peers would be a baron. The fourth from the bottom would be a viscount. Viscount and viscountess would be referred to as lord. Female viscountess would be referred to as your ladyship. So that you're going to come across today. And that is all the things I have for you before we dive into our final 2 chapters. So we have chapters 30 and 31 of Northanger Abbey, written by Jane Austen and read for us by the fabulous Maya Daguerre. Here we go.
Chapter 30. Catherine's disposition was not naturally sedentary, nor had her habits been ever very industrious, but whatever might hitherto have been her defects of that sort, her mother could not but perceive them now to be greatly increased. She could neither sit still nor employ herself for 10 minutes together, walking round the garden and orchard again and again, as if nothing but motion was voluntary, and seemed as if she could even walk about the house rather than remain fixed for any time in the parlour. Her loss of spirits was a yet greater alteration. In her rambling and her idleness she might only be a caricature of herself, but in her silence and sadness she was the very reverse of all that she had been before. For 2 days Mrs. Morland allowed it to pass, even without a hint, but when a third night's rest had neither restored her cheerfulness, improved her in useful activity, nor given her a greater inclination for needlework, she could no longer refrain from the gentle reproof of, "My dear Catherine, I'm afraid you're growing quite a fine lady. I do not know when poor Richard's cravats would be done, if he had no friend but you. Your head runs too much upon Bath. But there is a time for everything, a time for balls and plays, and a time for work. You've had a long run of amusement, and now you must try to be useful." Catherine took up her work directly, saying in a dejected voice that her head did not run upon Bath much. "Then you're fretting about General Tilney, and that is very simple of you. For 10 to 1, whether you ever see him again, you should never fret about trifles." After a short silence, "I hope, my Catherine, you're not getting out of humour with home, because it's not so grand as Northanger. That would be turning your visit into an evil indeed. Wherever you are, you should always be contented, but especially at home, because there you must spend the most of your time. I did not quite like at breakfast to hear you talk so much about the French bread at Northanger. I'm sure I do not care about the bread. It's all the same to me what I eat. There is a very clever essay in one of the books upstairs upon such a subject, about young girls who have been spoilt for home by great acquaintance. The Mirror, I think. I will look it out for you some day or other, because I'm sure it will do you good." Catherine said no more, and, with an endeavour to do right, applied to her work, but after a few minutes sunk again, without knowing it, herself, into languor and listlessness, moving herself in her chair for the irritation of weariness much oftener than she moved her needle. Mrs. Morland watched the progress of this relapse, and seeing in her daughter's absent and dissatisfied look a full proof of that repining spirit to which she had now begun to attribute her want of cheerfulness, hastily left the room to fetch the book in question, anxious to lose no time in attacking so dreadful a malady. It was some time before she could find what she looked for, and other family matters occurring to detain her, a quarter of an hour had elapsed ere she returned downstairs with the volume from which so much was hoped. Her avocations above having shut out all noise but what she created herself, she knew not that a visitor had arrived within the last few minutes, till, on entering the room, the first object she beheld was a young man whom she had never met before. With a look of much respect, he immediately rose, and being introduced to her by her conscious daughter as Mr. Henry Tilney, with the embarrassment of real sensibility, began to apologise for his appearance there, acknowledging that after what had passed he had little right to expect a welcome at Fullerton, and stating his impatience to be assured of Miss Morland's having reached her home in safety as the cause of the intrusion. He did not address himself to an uncandid judge or a resentful heart. Far from comprehending him or his sister in their father's misconduct, Mrs. Morland had always been kindly disposed towards each, and instantly, pleased by his appearance, received him with the simple professions of unaffected benevolence, thanking him for such an attention to her daughter, assuring him that the friends of her children were always welcome there, and entreating him to say not another word of the past. He was not ill inclined to obey this request, for though his heart was greatly relieved by such unlooked-for mildness, it was not just at that moment in his power to say anything to the purpose. Returning in silence to his seat, therefore, he remained for some minutes, most civilly answering all Mrs. Morland's common remarks about the weather and roads. Catherine, meanwhile, the anxious, agitated, happy, feverish Catherine, said not a word, but her glowing cheek and brightened eye made her mother trust that this good-natured visit would at least set her heart at ease for a time, and gladly therefore did she lay aside the first volume of the Mirror for a future hour. Desirous of Mr. Morland's assistance, as well in giving encouragement as finding conversation for her guest, whose embarrassment on his father's account she earnestly pitied, Mrs. Morland had very early dispatched one of the children to summon him. But Mr. Morland was from home, and being thus without any support at the end of quarter of an hour, she had nothing to say. After a couple of minutes' unbroken silence, Henry, turning to Catherine for the first time since her mother's entrance, asked her with sudden alacrity if Mr. and Mrs. Allen were now at Fullerton, and on developing from amidst all her perplexity of words in reply the meaning which one short syllable would have given, immediately expressed his intentions of paying his respects to them, and with a rising colour asked if she would have the goodness to show him the way. "You may see the house from this window, sir," was information on Sarah's side, which produced only a bow of acknowledgment from the gentleman, and a silencing nod from her mother, for Mrs. Morland, thinking it probable as a secondary consideration in his wish of waiting on their worthy neighbours that he might have some explanation to give of his father's behaviour, which it must be more pleasant for him to communicate only to Catherine, would not on any account prevent her accompanying him. They began their walk, and Mrs. Morland was not entirely mistaken in his object of wishing it. Some explanation on his father's account he had to give, but his first purpose was to explain himself, and before they reached Mr. Allen's grounds he had done it so well that Catherine did not think it could ever be repeated too often. She was assured of his affection, and that heart in return was solicited, which perhaps they pretty equally knew was already entirely his own, for though Henry was now sincerely attached to her, though he felt and delighted in all the excellencies of her character, and truly loved her society, I must confess that his affection originated in nothing better than gratitude, or in other words, that a persuasion of her partiality for him had been the only cause of giving her a serious thought. It is a new circumstance in romance, I acknowledge, and dreadfully derogatory of a heroine's dignity, but if it be as new in common life, the credit of a wild imagination will at least be all my own. A very short visit to Mrs. Allen, in which Henry talked at random without sense or connection, and Catherine, wrapped in the contemplation of her own unutterable happiness, scarcely opened her lips, dismissed them to the ecstasies of another tete-a-tete, and before it was suffered to close, she was enabled to judge how far he was sanctioned by parental authority in his present application. On his return from Woodston 2 days before, he had been met near the Abbey by his impatient father, hastily informed in angry terms of Miss Morland's departure, and ordered to think of her no more. Such was the permission upon which he had now offered her his hand. The affrighted Catherine, amidst all the terrors of expectation, as she listened to this account, could not but rejoice in the kind caution with which Henry had saved her from the necessity of a conscious rejection, by engaging her faith before he mentioned the subject, and as he proceeded to give the particulars and to explain the motives of his father's conduct, her feelings soon hardened into an even triumphant delight. The General had had nothing to accuse her of, nothing to lay to her charge, but her being the involuntary, unconscious object of a deception which his pride could not pardon, and which better pride would have been ashamed to own. She was guilty only of being less rich than he had supposed her to be. Under a mistaken persuasion of her possessions and claims had he courted her acquaintance in Bath, solicited her company at Northanger, and designed her for his daughter-in-law. On discovering his error, to turn her from the house seemed the best, though to his feelings an inadequate proof of his resentment towards her and his contempt of her family. John Thorpe had first misled him. The General, perceiving his son one night at the theatre to be paying considerable attention to Miss Morland, had accidentally inquired of Thorpe if he knew more of her than her name. Thorpe, most happy to be on speaking terms with a man of General Tilney's importance, had been joyfully and proudly communicative, and been at that time not only in daily expectation of Morland's engaging Isabella, but likewise pretty well resolved upon marrying Catherine himself, his vanity induced him to represent the family as yet more wealthy than his vanity and avarice had made him believe them. With whomsoever he was or was likely to be connected, his own consequence always required that theirs should be great, and as his intimacy with any acquaintance grew, so regularly grew their fortune. The expectations of his friend Morland, therefore, from the first overrated, had ever since his introduction to Isabella been gradually increasing, and by merely adding twice as much for the grandeur of the moment, by doubling what he chose to think the amount of Mr. Morland's preferment, trebling his private fortune, bestowing a rich aunt, and sinking half the children, he was able to represent the whole family to the General in the most respectable light. For Catherine, however, the peculiar object of the General's curiosity and his own speculations, he had yet something more in reserve, and the 10 or 15,000 pounds which her father could give her would be a pretty addition to Mr. Allen's estate. Her intimacy there had made him seriously determined on her being handsomely legacied hereafter, and to speak of her therefore as the most acknowledged future heiress of Fullerton naturally followed. Upon such intelligence the General had proceeded, for never had it occurred to him to doubt its authority. Thorpe's interest in the family, by his sister's approaching connection with one of its members, and his own views on another, circumstances of which he boasted with almost equal openness, seemed sufficient vouchers for its truth, and to these were added the absolute facts of the Allens being wealthy and childless, and of Miss Morland being under their care, and as soon as his acquaintance allowed him to judge of their treating her with parental kindness. His resolution was soon formed. Already had he discerned a liking towards Miss Morland in the countenance of his son, and thankful for Mr. Thorpe's communication, he almost instantly determined to spare no pains in weakening his boasted interest and ruining his dearest hopes. Catherine herself could not be more ignorant at the time of all this than his own children. Henry and Eleanor, perceiving nothing in her situation likely to engage their father's particular respect, had seen with astonishment the suddenness, continuance, and extent of his attention, and though latterly, from some hints which had accompanied an almost positive command to his son of doing everything in his power to attach her, Henry was convinced of his father's believing it to be an advantageous connection. It was not till the late explanation at Northanger that they had the smallest idea of the false calculation which had hurried him on. That they were false, the General had learned from the very person who had suggested them, from Thorpe himself, who he had chanced to meet again in town, and who, under the influence of exactly the opposite feelings, irritated by Catherine's refusal, and yet more by the failure of a very recent endeavour to accomplish a reconciliation between Morland and Isabella, convinced that they were separated for ever, and spurning a friendship which could no longer be serviceable, hastened to contradict all that he had said before to the advantage of the Morlands, confessed himself to have been totally mistaken in his opinion of their circumstance and character, misled by the rhodomontade of his friend to believe his father a man of substance and credit, whereas the transactions of the 2 or 3 last weeks proved him to be neither, for after coming eagerly forward on the first overture of a marriage between the families, with the most liberal proposals, He had, on being brought to the point by the shrewdness of the relator, been constrained to acknowledge himself incapable of giving the young people even a decent support. They were, in fact, a necessitous family, numerous too, almost beyond example, and by no means respected in their own neighbourhood, as he had lately had particular opportunities of discovering, aiming at a style of life which their fortune could not warrant, seeking to better themselves by wealthy connections, a forward, bragging, scheming race. The terrified general pronounced the name of Allen with an inquiring look, and here too Thorpe had learned his error. The Allens, he believed, had lived near them too long, and he knew the young man on whom the Fullertons' estate must devolve. The general needed no more. Enraged with almost everybody in the world but himself, he set out the next day for the Abbey, where his performances had been seen. I leave it to my reader's sagacity to determine how much of all this was possible for Henry to communicate at this time to Catherine, how much of it he could have learned from his father, in what points his own conjectures might assist him, and what portion must yet remain to be told in a letter from James. I have united for their ease what they must divide for mine. Catherine, at any rate, heard enough to feel that in suspecting General Tilney of either murdering or shutting up his wife, she had scarcely sinned against his character or magnified his cruelty. Henry, in having such things to relate of his father, was almost as pitiable as in their first avowal to himself. He blushed for the narrow-minded counsel which he was obliged to expose. The conversation between them at Northanger had been of the most unfriendly kind. Henry's indignation on hearing how Catherine had been treated on comprehending his father's views and being ordered to acquiesce in them had been open and bold. The general, accustomed on every ordinary occasion to give the law in his family, prepared for no reluctance but of feeling, no opposing desire that should dare to clothe itself in words, could ill brook the opposition of his son, steadily as the sanction of reason and the dictate of conscience could make it. But in such a cause, his anger, though it must shock, could not intimidate Henry, who was sustained in his purpose by a conviction of its justice. He felt himself bound, as much in honour as in affection, to Miss Morland, and believing that heart to be his own which he had been directed to gain, no unworthy retraction of a tacit consent, no reversing decree of unjustifiable anger could shake his fidelity, or influence the resolutions it prompted. He steadily refused to accompany his father to Herefordshire, an engagement formed almost at the moment to promote the dismissal of Catherine, and as steadily declared his intention of offering her his hand. The general was furious in his anger, and they parted in dreadful disagreement. Henry, in an agitation of mind which many solitary hours were required to compose, had returned almost instantly to Woodston, and on the afternoon of the following day had begun his journey to Fullerton. Chapter 31. Mr and Mrs Morland's surprise on being applied to by Mr Tilney for their consent to his marrying their daughter was for a few minutes considerable, it having never entered their heads to suspect an attachment on either side. But as nothing after all could be more natural than Catherine's being beloved, they soon learnt to consider it with only the happy agitation of gratified pride, and as far as they alone were concerned, had not a single objection to start. His pleasing manners and good sense were self-evident recommendations, and having never heard evil of him, it was not their way to suppose any evil could be told. Goodwill supplying the place of experience, his character needed no attestation. Catherine would make a sad, heedless young housekeeper, to be sure, was her mother's foreboding remark, but quick was the consolation of there being nothing like practice. There was but one obstacle, in short, to be mentioned, but till that one was removed it must be impossible for them to sanction the engagement. Their tempers were mild, but their principles were steady, and while his parents so expressly forbade the connection, they could not allow themselves to encourage it. That the general should come forward to solicit the alliance, or that he should even very heartily approve it, they were not refined enough to make any parading stipulation, but the decent appearance of consent must be yielded, and that once obtained, and their own hearts made them trust that it could not be very long denied, their willing approbation was instantly to follow. His consent was all that they wished for. They were no more inclined than entitled to demand his money. Of a very considerable fortune, his son was by marriage settlements eventually secure. His present income was an income of independence and comfort, and under every pecuniary view it was a match beyond the claims of their daughter. The young people could not be surprised at a decision like this. They felt and they deplored, but they could not resent it, and they parted, endeavouring to hope that such a change in the general, as each believed almost impossible, might speedily take place, to unite them again in the fullness of privileged affection. Henry returned to what was now his only home, to watch over his young plantations and extend his improvements for her sake, to whose share in them he looked anxiously forward, and Catherine remained at Fullerton to cry. Whether the torments of absence were softened by a clandestine correspondence, let us not inquire. Mr and Mrs Morland never did, and they had been too kind to exact any promise, and whenever Catherine received a letter, as at the time happened pretty often, they always looked another way. The anxiety which in this state of their attachment must be the portion of Henry and Catherine, and of all who loved either, as to its final event, can hardly extend, I fear, to the bosom of my readers, who will see in the telltale compression of the pages before them that we are all hastening together to perfect felicity. The means by which their early marriage was effected can be the only doubt. What probable circumstance would work upon a temper like the General's? The circumstance which chiefly availed was the marriage of his daughter with a man of fortune and consequence, which took place in the course of the summer. An accession of dignity that threw him into a fit of good humour, from which he did not recover till after Eleanor had obtained his forgiveness of Henry, and his permission for him to be a fool if he liked it. The marriage of Eleanor Tilney, her removal from all the evils of such a home as Northanger had been made by Henry's banishment to the home of her choice and the man of her choice, is an event which I expect to give general satisfaction among all her acquaintance. My own joy on the occasion is very sincere. I know no one more entitled by unpretending merit, or better prepared by habitual suffering, to receive and enjoy felicity. Her partiality for this gentleman was not of recent origin, and he had been long withheld only by inferiority of situation from addressing her. His unexpected accession to title and fortune had removed all his difficulties, and never had the General loved his daughter so well in all her hours of companionship, utility, and patient endurance, as when he first hailed her your ladyship. Her husband was really deserving of her, independent of his peerage, his wealth, and his attachment, being to a precision the most charming young man in the world. Any further definition of his merits must be unnecessary. The most charming young man in the world is instantly before the imagination of us all. Concerning the one in question, therefore, I have only to add, aware that the rules of composition forbid the introduction of a character not connected with my fable, that this was the very gentleman whose negligent servant left behind him the collection of washing bills resulting from a long visit at Northanger, by which my heroine was involved in one of her most alarming adventures. The influence of the Viscount and Viscountess on their brother's behalf was assisted by that right understanding of Mr Morland's circumstances, which, as soon as the General would allow himself to be informed, they were qualified to give. It taught him that he had been scarcely more misled by Thorpe's first boast of the family wealth than by his subsequent malicious overthrow of it, that in no sense of the word were they necessitous or poor, and that Catherine would have £3,000. This was so material an amendment of his late expectations that it greatly contributed to smooth the descent of his pride, and by no means without its effect was the private intelligence which he was at some pains to procure, that the Fullerton estate, being entirely at the disposal of its present proprietor, was consequently open to every greedy speculation. On the strength of this, the General, soon after Eleanor's marriage, permitted his son to return to Northanger, and thence made him the bearer of his consent, very courteously worded in a page full of empty professions to Mr Morland. The event which it authorised soon followed. Henry and Catherine were married. The bells rang, and everybody smiled, and as this took place within a 12-month from the first day of their meeting, it will not appear, after all the dreadful delays occasioned by the General's cruelty, that they were essentially hurt by it. To begin perfect happiness at the respective ages of 26 and 18 is to do pretty well, and professing myself, moreover, convinced that the General's unjust interference, so far from being really injurious to their felicity, was perhaps rather conducive to it, by improving their knowledge of each other and adding strength to their attachment, I leave it to be settled by whomsoever it may concern, whether the tendency of this work be altogether to recommend parental tyranny or reward filial disobedience. The end.
And they lived happily ever after. Okay, we knew it was going to end happily. That's great. There are some interesting things about that ending, however, that we will get to in a moment. Before we do, there were a couple of tidbits that I didn't want to share with you in advance because I didn't want to spoil anything, but I do want to go back and pick up a couple of things that were mentioned. One, Henry Tilney did not fall in love with Catherine at first sight. This is part of Northanger Abbey's anti-Gothic stance. In Gothic novels, obviously, and romantic capital R novels, they both would have seen each other, fallen in love with each other, been swept off their feet with adoration, blah, blah, blah. Didn't happen. Henry really only started noticing Catherine because Catherine really seemed to be into him, and then over time grew to appreciate her. And I have a voicemail for you a little bit later that talks about that. But they actually grew to care about each other for real over time, and especially over the amount of time where they were surreptitiously writing letters to each other, which I'll talk about a little bit more when we get there. I'm going through the chapters in order right now, as you do. There was one tricky piece of prose towards the beginning of chapter 30 that he engaged her faith before he mentioned the subject. Henry Tilney made sure that he wanted to marry her before he let her know what General Tilney's beef was, because he knew she's too good a person. If he had explained General Tilney's mental situation first, she would never have agreed to this. She would never have agreed to marry him because that would have gone against his father's wishes, and she's not that kind of person. And so he knew her well enough to know that he was going to have to make sure that this was something she really did want before continuing the narrative with her. General Tilney presents an interesting problem within Jane Austen. She works very hard in all of her books to create real people with real problems, real complicated people. Elizabeth Bennet being one of the most famous for her layers of complexity and her very real flaws, as well as her very real characteristics that we bookish, we happy few, we bookish people tend to admire an awful lot. Jane Austen did get criticized at the time. She had obviously passed away already, but when this book was published, but her book did get criticized at the time for General Tilney. He's a little too easy a villain and a little too implausible for Thorpe to have convinced him of Catherine's situation and the Morlands' wealth, knowing how Thorpe spoke and how hyperbolic he could get, and the fact that the story would have kind of grown over time as he spoke to Tilney. And of course, you can understand, Thorpe being Thorpe, he would have taken his already overblown tale that he seems to have really believed himself, because he was trying to get his sister married to Catherine's brother. So Thorpe obviously believed it, but that doesn't mean he would have been refraining from adding to the lore while talking to General Tilney. We know from the way Thorpe spoke in front of us that it would have been weird for someone like General Tilney, who clearly has a head on his shoulders, to have bought everything that John was selling. And that is a little far-fetched and hard to swallow. However, it is certainly in keeping with a Gothic narrative. And so how everybody else, all of our non-Gothic characters, we have a villain in Thorpe, we have a villain, in air quotes, in General Tilney, and older son Tilney fits into the Byronic hero, capital R romantic, capital G Gothic. He also fits into that mold. Outside of them, it's how everybody else responds to those situations. That is the anti-Gothic part, or the satirizing the Gothic part of Northanger Abbey. One of the other complaints about General Tilney was that never, from the first moment when Catherine races into their drawing room to explain what happened with Isabella lying about their going for a walk, from that moment on, Catherine never behaves like a great lady in front of General Tilney. And so he would have to have ignored all of that evidence, just have been so dollar signs for eyeballs all the way along, including not having sent out some feelers himself, at least to find out, while in Bath, a little bit more about the Allens from somebody other than Thorpe, who he spoke to because I think they were in the gambling room or the card room, and that was the only place he knew Thorpe from. So, yeah, you kind of have to agree with the criticism. At the same time, who cares? Great story. However, the other place, and it's probably less forgivable, in trying to bring the novel to a reasonably lengthed close, Jane Austen had to have General Tilney send Catherine home rather precipitately. And that treatment truly was shocking at the time. And it needed to be. It needed to be a complete break. And it needed to cast no doubt on the fact that Henry and Catherine were not going to be a thing. We needed that to happen for the end of the book to be satisfying. There's no way that a gentleman would have done that. It's really, really hard to believe that. And in fact, this one part of the book was criticized by some of the Gothic authors at the time, mostly and importantly because word of that would have gotten around. Nothing stays hidden forever. Chances are word of what Tilney had done to Catherine would have gotten around, and that breach of good behavior actually could have not ruined, but damaged his reputation amongst his friends, especially since he's taking his responsibility for his position in society rather seriously. And so that's a legitimate criticism. So Tilney and Thorpe really do become the most Gothic of all of our characters. Well, Tilney doesn't exactly stay in that category. Interestingly enough, we never really hear any kind of concluding text on Thorpe and Isabella, which is odd. The Gothic novels definitely wrapped up all their loose ends. What you thought was a ghost turned out to be a curtain with a window pane, in front of a window pane that had been broken, and so air was coming in. Every single thing winds up getting wrapped up at the end of these Gothic novels. Jane Austen did not do that for us, and I have a feeling that, one, it was to save time and not break the narrative, but also because we're trying to have a happy ending. And while it's fairly certain that Isabella, and to a lesser extent Thorpe, because he's a guy and he would have gotten away with it anyway, Isabella was not heading anywhere particularly positive for her. They did a nice job in the movie version of pretty clearly implying that Captain Tilney had his way with her. She, of course, foolishly thinking that they were going to get married. It's kind of hard not to think that that is, if not likely, was going to happen at some point with Isabella. She was not well governed by her own mind in that respect. However, one of Austen's points in writing stories like Northanger Abbey was to do what the Gothic novels couldn't do. the chances of any young woman at the time to have actually experienced anything remotely like the drama of these Gothic novels was nil. However, the chances of young women coming into contact with someone like Thorpe was very high. And in this respect, she really was able to give some kind of moral guidance to young women and young men on the very real dangers that might await them as they emerge out into society and start to have to learn how to adult. And that's one of the beautiful things about Jane Austen. It's very similar to Anne Bronte and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. The husband was a bit of a Byronic hero and a little over the top. However, we know from Anne Bronte's personal history and other writings of the time, he was far from the worst real life household tyrant of his ilk. He just happened to be one that was written and fictionalized in a Bronte book. And there's a little bit more about Henry and Catherine. Early on, it feels very lopsided, their relationship. To me, it felt rather lopsided. Like Henry was definitely the older and wiser, and Catherine was the younger and not just more innocent, but more naive and perhaps not quite as bright. However, they're in an interesting juxtaposition as we come to the end of the novel, because Catherine's family has behaved so beautifully in the face of the situation, and General Tilney has been so appalling, that there is a familial equilibrium that is set. Both Henry and Catherine themselves behave well. Just because the Morlands don't have as much money as the Tilneys, however, has not harmed their standing as far as the viewer of this story goes. They are, money aside, better people. And that would not be lost on someone like Henry. And it also shouldn't be lost on us that for Henry to actively go against his father's wishes is a heroic stance. In a simple story like this, something that is not overwrought and swashbuckling, what Henry does, this quiet, dignified refusal to follow bad advice given by his father, especially when his father is who General Tilney is really quite admirable. And it just makes me like Henry all that much more. Now, one of the places where Jane really does kind of trip over the Gothic novel trope is in the very, very last chapter, almost sort of introducing a completely new character. In the movie version, they avoided this problem by sort of introducing Eleanor's love interest earlier. Here he is kind of a deus ex machina. He sweeps in, he's the god from the machine who flies in to save the day. Jane ties this back to the earlier part of the narrative by having his servant be the one who left the laundry bills in the chest. That is ridiculous and goofy and funny and just fine, because we know that Eleanor is with the person that she wanted to be with, and that's great. And the slightly more complicated problem that Jane Austen kind of talks around is that he must have been the second son and not going to inherit the title or the estate, the fortune, if his older brother had passed away or something like that. Then the second son would have become the heir, and that must have been what happened in order for Eleanor to make this felicitous alliance, allowing her to have a happy ending as well, which God knows she deserved. There was an oblique reference to the Fullerton estate, the Allens' estate, having no entailment on it. This is General Tilney does finally check up, finds out that the Allens, who don't have any children, who very well might leave something to the Morland children, or perhaps to Catherine, their favorite. Since there's no entailment on it, it means that there's no legal path that the property ownership has to follow, which means there is every chance that the property, should it come to Catherine, would be unencumbered by previous decisions made by previous generations and would be available to be used as or added to the larger Tilney estate. So that's where General Tilney was going with that. Jane Austen also, because by the time she finishes the book, she is no longer 17 years old. She does end it, interestingly, with the parental tyranny of General Tilney forcing the two young lovers to take their time and write each other these surreptitious letters. They shouldn't have been corresponding with each other directly, female to male, unmarried people, without an announced engagement. However, we know that the Morlands have decided to look the other way. When letters came to Catherine, we assume that Henry had worked out something with Catherine so that her letters could be delivered to him without arousing suspicion from General Tilney, or she sent them to his parsonage. But either way, even though the entire story took under a year, Henry and Catherine spent the bulk of it only being able to correspond, not seeing each other. And they learned a lot about each other that way. And in a Barrett Browning fashion, found that they really were a good match for each other. So if General Tilney hadn't been such a punk, that wouldn't have happened. And that might have made their happy ending more troublesome or challenging to maintain after the wedding. So she leaves that question to the dear reader at the end, whether it is to recommend parental tyranny, General Tilney's keeping them apart long enough that they could get to know each other better, or to reward filial disobedience, the fact that they were disobeying their parents in considering, or at least their parent, in considering the match at all and writing back and forth to each other. So it's a sweet end to a sweet book with some truly sweet people in it. And how lovely. So I have one voicemail to play for you from Jana Lee, and then I have a surprise. So here we go with Jana Lee.
Hi, Heather. This is Jan Lee, and it's an Hikes and Ravelry. I just finished episode 560, so I finished 559 and 560. Right, 559 was right up my alley. I loved that chapter, or that section of the book. I had a couple of comments on that one. I think my favorite line out of that was when Henry was speaking to Catherine, and he says, "Your mind is warped by an innate principle of general integrity," because she's expecting people to act honestly, both his father and Isabella. And I find it hilarious that he sees that and he comments on it, but he's not commenting like, "Oh, you're so naive, wait until you've grown up." He's saying, your mind is warped by an innate principle of general integrity. You're not going to understand these people because you are better than they are. And I find that hilarious. I think it's awesome that both that he values that about her, but also that he's teasing her about it a little bit. I also love that still Catherine is so surprised by the general's behavior that, "Oh no, anything will do for dinner. It's just fine. Don't put yourself out. We'll just come whenever." And, and then he rearranges everybody's days so that you can come on Wednesday because that's the only day that will work for him. But then Henry heads out 2 days early to stare at his housekeeper and preparing a proper meal. And Catherine is so surprised that he has to leave. But your father just said he didn't mind if, he didn't want you to put yourself out. I'm sure he'd be okay with it. And Henry just smiles at her. Because he knows better. But he just really enjoys that she is so honest and straightforward. I also had to comment that Amelia Peabody, Those Mysteries, and Elizabeth Peters as an author, I found her and fell in love with those books. I have not read or have not listened to any of them on audiobooks. I'll have to try them. But as far as the books go, they bring a lot of delight to my life. I really have enjoyed them. The second thing that I wanted to touch on was in episode 560, Catherine's return home. It strikes me as both amusing, and it explains a lot about Catherine and her reactions to both that she can indulge herself in the love of Gothic novels, but also that when she's actually put into that position herself, she doesn't react like a heroine would. She reacts like a normal person, and she stays up late and she packs, and she's not focused on the weather or, on how difficult the trip is. She just makes the next step and finds people to help her along the way and gets herself home all right. But I love that her parents and family, while they're upset at her treatment, they don't assume that it's her fault. I think that's awesome. And I also think that my favorite part was when her mother was speaking to the younger sister, Sarah, about it and said, not to spend time worrying about it. But the mom says that the reason for General Tilney's bad behavior is something not at all worth understanding. I think that dismissal would bother him. I think it would stay with him much longer than his bad behavior towards his guests to stay with Catherine and her family. And I feel like that's kind of the best revenge. That they forgive and they forget about it. And he's probably still stuck on I would never behave like this. I'm a proper person. We don't know the reasoning behind it, but I feel like being as how it's General Tilney is probably not something that, anyway, well, we'll see. We'll see in the last chapter, but it does speak highly of the family's good sense, and it really kind of just brings home like the good background that Catherine has been given, like her parents and her family and the neighborhood that she's grown up in. They see stuff and they can comment on it being, oh, this is really bad. I'm so glad that you made it home. Let's not worry about that anymore. Yes, General Tilney behaved very badly, but, it's something not at all worth understanding. We're not going to waste our time on it. We're not going to waste our energy on it. Anyway, I love her mom. It's great.
I am so happy that people have seemed to like this book so much. I really did too. It's been a lot of fun. It was a nice palate cleanser after The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. And as I make my final choice for the next book we're going to do, I told you it was going to be a mystery. I am holding to that, but I am also able to tell you that the next book, it'll be an American author, and we have back for us the fabulous Kim Zuckert to read for the next book. I don't have the title of the book for you yet. I am having a hard time deciding amongst, I think it's three. I've narrowed it down to 3. And so I'm going to take the next couple of weeks to work on that, figure out which one I'm going to do, get the book to Kim, and figure mid-August is when I will be back with our next book. In the meantime, my surprise to you is this. I went on to LibriVox and found one audio recording of Jane Austen's History of England. You will remember that Catherine and Henry, one of their conversations early on was about histories, and Catherine was very critical of them because they seemed to all be dates and men doing manly things, and the historians never seemed to write about anyone except the people that they liked, and the villains couldn't possibly have been that villainous. And all of this goes back to Jane Austen wrote her own History of England, I believe, when she was 15. And it is very silly and a lot of fun. And the girl who does the reading does a lovely job. So I am going to play you out with The History of England by Jane Austen. So until August, be well, take care of yourself, take care of each other, wear a mask, get a vaccine if you can. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
The History of England, from the reign of Henry IV to the death of Charles I, by a partial, prejudiced, and ignorant historian. To Miss Austen, eldest daughter of the Reverend George Austen, this work is inscribed with all due respect by the author. In B, there will be very few dates in this history. The history of England. Henry IV. Henry IV ascended the throne of England, much to his own satisfaction, in the year 1399, after having prevailed on his cousin and predecessor, Richard II, to resign it to him and to retire for the rest of his life to Pomfret Castle, where he happened to be murdered. It is to be supposed that Henry was married, since he had certainly 4 sons, but it is not in my power to inform the reader who was his wife. Be this as it may, he did not live forever, but falling ill, his son, the Prince of Wales, came and took away the crown, whereupon the king made a long speech, for which I must refer the reader to Shakespeare's plays, and the prince made a still longer. Things being thus settled between them, the king died, and was succeeded by his son Henry, who had previously beat Sir William Gascoigne. Henry V. This prince, after he succeeded to the throne, grew quite reformed and amiable, forsaking all his dissipated companions and never thrashing Sir William again. During his reign, Lord Cobham was burnt alive, but I forget what for. His Majesty then turned his thoughts to France, where he went and fought the famous battle of Agincourt. He afterwards married the king's daughter Catherine, a very agreeable woman by Shakespeare's account. In spite of all this, however, he died, and was succeeded by his son Henry. Henry VI. I cannot say much for this monarch's sins, nor would I if I could, for he was a Lancastrian. I suppose you know all about the wars between him and the Duke of York, who was of the right side. If you do not, you had better read some other history, for I shall not be very diffuse in this, meaning by it only to vent my spleen against, and show my hatred to all those people whose parties or principles do not suit with mine, and not to give information. This king married Margaret of Anjou, a woman whose distresses and misfortunes were so great as almost to make me who hate her pity her. It was in this reign that Joan of Arc lived and made such a row among the English. They should not have burnt her, but they did. There were several battles between the Yorkists and Lancastrians, in which the former, as they ought, usually conquered. At length they were entirely overcome, the king was murdered, the queen was sent home, and Edward IV ascended the throne. Edward IV. This monarch was famous only for his beauty and his courage, of which the picture we have here given of him, and his undaunted behavior in marrying one woman while he was engaged to another, are sufficient proofs. His wife was Elizabeth Woodville, a widow who, poor woman, was afterwards confined in a convent by that monster of iniquity and avarice, Henry VII. One of Edward's mistresses was Jane Shore, who has had a play written about her, but it is a tragedy and therefore not worth reading. Having performed all these noble actions, his Majesty died, and was succeeded by his son, Edward V. This unfortunate prince lived so little a while that nobody had time to draw his picture. He was murdered by his uncle's contrivance, whose name was Richard III. Richard III. The character of this prince has been in general very severely treated by historians, but as he was a York, I am rather inclined to suppose him a very respectable man. It has indeed been confidently asserted that he killed his 2 nephews and his wife, but it has also been declared that he did not kill his 2 nephews, which I am inclined to believe true. And if this is the case, it may also be affirmed that he did not kill his wife. For if Perkin Warbeck was really the Duke of York, why not Lambert Simnel be the widow of Richard? Whether innocent or guilty, he did not reign long in peace, for Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, as great a villain as ever lived, made a great fuss about getting the crown, and having killed the king at the Battle of Bosworth, he succeeded to it. Henry VII. This monarch, soon after his accession, married the Princess Elizabeth of York, by which alliance he plainly proved that he thought his own right inferior to hers, though he pretended to the contrary. By this marriage he had 2 sons and 2 daughters, the elder of which daughters was married to the King of Scotland, and had the happiness of being grandmother to one of the first characters of the world, but of her I shall have occasion to speak more at large in future. The youngest, Mary, married first the King of France, and secondly the Duke of Suffolk, by whom she had 1 daughter, afterwards the mother of Lady Jane Grey, who, though inferior to her lovely cousin the Queen of Scots, was yet an amiable young woman, and famous for reading Greek while other people were hunting. It was in the reign of Henry VII that Perkin Warbeck and Lambert Simnel, before mentioned, made their appearance, the former of whom was set in the stocks, took shelter in Benliow Abbey, and was beheaded with the Earl of Warwick, and the latter was taken into the king's kitchen. His Majesty died and was succeeded by his son Henry, whose only merit was his not being quite so bad as his daughter Elizabeth. Henry VIII. It would be an affront to my readers were I to suppose that they were not as well acquainted with the particulars of this king's reign as I am myself. I will therefore save them the task of reading again what they have read before, and myself the trouble of writing what I do not perfectly recollect, by giving only a slight sketch of the principal events which marked his reign. Among these may be ranked Cardinal Wolsey's telling the father abbot of Leicester Abbey that he was come to lay his bones among them, the Reformation in religion, and the king's riding through the streets of London with Anne Boleyn. It is, however, but justice and my duty to declare that this amiable woman was entirely innocent of the crimes with which she was accused, and of which her beauty, her elegance, and her sprightliness were sufficient proofs, not to mention her solemn protestations of innocence, the weakness of the charges against her, and the king's character, all of which add some confirmation, though perhaps but slight ones when in comparison with those before alleged in her favor. Though I do not profess giving many dates, yet as I think it proper to give some, and shall of course make the choice of those which it is most necessary for the reader to know, I think it right to inform him that her letter to the king was dated the 6th of May. The crimes and cruelties of this prince were too numerous to be mentioned, as this history, I trust, has fully shown, and nothing can be said in his vindication, but that his abolishing religious houses, and leaving them to the ruinous depredations of time, has been of infinite use to the landscape of England in general, which probably was a principal motive for his doing it, since otherwise, why should a man who was of no religion himself be at so much trouble to abolish one which had for ages been established in the kingdom? His Majesty's 5th wife was the Duke of Norfolk's niece, who, though universally acquitted of the crimes for which she was beheaded, has been by many people supposed to have led an abandoned life before her marriage. Of this, however, I have many doubts, since she was a relation of that noble Duke of Norfolk, who was so warm in the Queen of Scotland's cause, and who at last fell a victim to it. The king's last wife contrived to survive him, but with difficulty effected it. He was succeeded by his only son, Edward. Edward the 6th. As this prince was only 9 years old at the time of his father's death, he was considered by many people as too young to govern, and the late king happening to be of the same opinion, his mother's brother, the Duke of Somerset, was chosen protector of the realm during his minority. This man, on the whole, was a very amiable character, and is somewhat of a favourite with me, though I would by no means pretend to affirm that he was equal to those first of men, Robert, Earl of Essex, Delmere, or Gilpin. He was beheaded, of which he might with reason have been proud, had he known that such was the death of Mary Queen of Scotland, but as it was impossible that he should be conscious of what had never happened, it does not appear that he felt particularly delighted with the manner of it. After his decease, the Duke of Northumberland had the care of the king and the kingdom, and performed his trust of both so well that the king died, and the kingdom was left to his daughter-in-law, the Lady Jane Grey, who has already been mentioned as reading Greek. Whether she really understood that language, or whether such a study proceeded only from an excess of vanity, for which I believe she was always rather remarkable, is uncertain. Whatever might be the cause, she preserved in the same appearance of knowledge and contempt of what was generally esteemed to be pleasure during the whole of her life, for she declared herself displeased with being appointed queen, and while conducting to the scaffold, she wrote a sentence in Latin and another in Greek on seeing the dead body of her husband accidentally passing that way. Mary. This woman had the good luck of being advanced to the throne of England in spite of the superior pretensions, merit, and beauty of her cousins Mary Queen of Scotland and Jane Grey. Nor can I pity the kingdom for the misfortunes they experienced during her reign, since they fully deserved them, for having allowed her to succeed her brother, which was a double piece of folly, since they might have foreseen that as she died without children, she would be succeeded by that disgrace to humanity, that pest to society, Elizabeth. Many were the people who fell martyrs to the Protestant religion during her reign. I suppose not fewer than a dozen. She married Philip, King of Spain, who in her sister's reign was famous for building armadas. She died without issue, and then the dreadful moment came in which the destroyer of all comfort, the deceitful betrayer of trust reposed in her, and the murderess of her cousin succeeded to the throne. Elizabeth. It was the peculiar misfortune of this woman to have bad ministers. Since wicked as she herself was, she could not have committed such extensive mischief had not these vile and abandoned men connived at and encouraged her in her crimes. I know that it has by many people been asserted and believed that Lord Burleigh, Sir Francis Walsingham, and the rest who filled the chief offices of state were deserving, experienced, and able minister. But oh, how blinded such writers and such readers must be to merit despised, neglected, and defamed, if they can persist in such opinions when they reflect that these men, these boasted men, were such scandals to their country and their sex as to allow and assist their queen in confining for the space of 19 years a woman who, if the claims of relationship and merit were of no avail, yet as a queen, and as one who condescended to place confidence in her, had every reason to expect assistance and protection, and at length in allowing Elizabeth to bring this amiable woman to an untimely, unmerited, and scandalous death. Can any one, if he reflects but for a moment on this blot, this everlasting blot upon their understanding and their character, allow any praise to Lord Burleigh or Sir Francis Walsingham? Oh, what must this bewitching princess, whose only friend was the Duke of Norfolk, and whose only ones now, Mr. Whitaker, Mrs. Leffery, Mrs. Knight, and myself, who was abandoned by her son, confined by her cousin, abused, reproached, and vilified by all, what must her most noble mind have suffered when informed that Elizabeth had given orders for her death? Yet she bore it with the most unshaken fortitude, firm in her mind, constant in her religion, and prepared herself to meet the cruel fate to which she was doomed with a magnanimity that would alone proceed from conscious innocence. And yet, could you, reader, have believed it possible that some hardened and zealous Protestants have even abused her for that steadfastness in Catholic religion which reflected on her so much credit? But this is a striking proof of their narrow souls and prejudiced judgments who accuse her. She was executed in the great hall at Fortheringay Castle, sacred place, on Wednesday, the 8th of February, 1586, to the everlasting reproach of Elizabeth, her ministers, and of England in general. It may not be unnecessary, before I entirely conclude my account of this ill-fated queen, to observe that she had been accused of several crimes during the time of her reigning in Scotland, of which I now most seriously do assure my reader that she was entirely innocent, having never been guilty of anything more than imprudencies into which she was betrayed by the openness of her heart, her youth, and her education. Having, I trust, by this assurance, entirely done away with every suspicion and every doubt which might have arisen in the reader's mind, from what other historians have written of her, I shall proceed to mention the remaining events that marked Elizabeth's reign. It was about this time that Sir Francis Drake, the first English navigator who sailed around the world, lived to be the ornament of his country and his profession. Yet, great as he was, and justly celebrated as a sailor, I cannot help foreseeing that he will be equalled in this or the next century by one who, though now but young, already promises to answer all the ardent and sanguine expectations of his relations and friends, amongst whom I may class the amiable lady to whom this work is dedicated, and my no less amiable self. Though of a different profession and shining in a different sphere of life, yet equally conspicuous in the character of an earl, as Drake was in that of a sailor, was Robert Devereux, Lord of Essex. This unfortunate young man was not unlike in character to that equally unfortunate one, Frederick Delmere. The simile may be carried still farther, and Elizabeth, the torment of Essex, may be compared to Emmeline of Delmere. It would be endless to recount the misfortunes of this noble and gallant Earl. It is sufficient to say that he was beheaded on the 25th of February, after having been Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, after having clapped his hand on his sword, and after performing many other services to his country. Elizabeth did not long survive his loss, and died so miserable that were it not an injury to the memory of Mary, I should pity her. James I. Though this king had some faults, among which, and as the most principal, was his allowing his mother's death, yet considered on the whole, I cannot help liking him. He married Anne of Denmark, and had several children. Fortunately for him, his eldest son, Prince Henry, died before his father, or he might have experienced the evils which befell his unfortunate brother. As I am myself partial to the Roman Catholic religion, it is with infinite regret that I am obliged to blame the behavior of any member of it. Yet truth being, I think, very excusable in a historian, I am necessitated to say that in this reign the Roman Catholics of England did not behave like gentlemen to the Protestants. Their behavior indeed to the royal family and both houses of Parliament might justly be considered by them as very uncivil, and even Sir Henry Percy, though certainly the best bred man of the party, had none of that general politeness which is so universally pleasing, as his attentions were entirely confined to Lord Monteagle. Sir Walter Raleigh flourished in this and the preceding reign, and is by many people held in great veneration and respect. But as he was an enemy of the noble Essex, I have nothing to say in praise of him, and must refer all those who may wish to be acquainted with the particulars of his life to Mr. Sheridan's play of The Critic, where they will find many interesting anecdotes of him, as well as of his friend, Sir Christopher Hatton. His Majesty was of that amiable disposition which inclines to friendship, and in such points was possessed of a keener penetration in discovering merit than many other people. I once heard an excellent charade on a carpet, of which the subject I am now on reminds me, and as I think it may afford my reader some amusement to find it out, I shall here take the liberty of presenting it to them. Charade. My first is what my second was to King James I, and you tread upon my whole. The principal favourites of his Majesty were Carr, who was afterwards created Earl of Somerset, and whose name perhaps may have some share in the above-mentioned charade, and George Villiers, afterward Duke of Buckingham. On his Majesty's death he was succeeded by his son Charles. Charles I. This amiable monarch seems born to have suffered misfortunes equal to those of his lovely grandmother, misfortunes which he could not deserve, since he was her descendant. Never certainly were there before so many detestable characters at one time in England as in this period of its history. Never were amiable men so scarce, the number of them throughout the whole kingdom acounting to only 5, besides the inhabitants of Oxford, who were always loyal to their king and faithful to his interests. The names of this noble 5, who never forgot the duty of the subject, or swerved from their attachment to his Majesty, were as follows: the King himself, ever steadfast in his own support, Archbishop Laud, Earl of Stratford, Viscount Falkland, and Duke of Ormond, who were scarcely less strenuous or zealous in the cause. While the villains of this time would make too long a list to be written or read, I shall therefore content myself with mentioning the leaders of the gang. Cromwell, Fairfax, Hampden, and Pym may be considered as the original causers of distresses and civil wars in which England for many years was embroiled. In this reign, as well as in that of Elizabeth, I am obliged, in spite of my attachment to the Scotch, to consider them as equally guilty with the generality of the English, since they dared to think differently from their sovereign, to forget the adoration which as stewards it was their duty to pay them, to rebel against, dethrone, and imprison the unfortunate Mary, to oppose, to deceive, and to sell the no less unfortunate Charles. The events of this monarch's reign are too numerous for my pen, and indeed the recital of any events, except what I make myself, is uninteresting to me. My principal reason for undertaking the history of England being to prove the innocence of the Queen of Scotland, which I flatter myself with having effectually done, and to abuse Elizabeth, though I am rather fearful of having fallen short in the latter part of my scheme. as therefore it is not my intention to give any particular account of the distresses into which this king was involved, through the misconduct and cruelty of his parliament. I shall satisfy myself with vindicating him from the reproach of arbitrary and tyrannical government, with which he has often been charged. This, I feel, is not difficult to be done, for with one argument I am certain of satisfying every sensible and well-disposed person whose opinions have been properly guided by a good education, and this argument is that he was a Stuart. Finney, Saturday, November 26th, 1791.
I almost totally forgot. Super important for you to know. Even more important than the history of England. Justin, our editor for the last several years, has written a book. It is called The Tide Will Erase All, a science fiction novel at the end of reality. There is a YouTube promo for it that is so cool, and I'm having Justin put a link to that into the show notes for you. But please, please, please do check it out. You can pre-order now. It is out and available on July 13th. So congratulations, Justin. And please, everybody, go take a look at the video promo and put in your pre-orders. All right, now I'm really going. Take care. Have a great one. I'll talk to you soon. Bye. If you like what you hear on Craftlit, please review us on iTunes, like us on Facebook, join in the fun in our Facebook group, which is Craftlit Annotated Audiobooks. Always the nicest group of people you're going to find on Facebook, and the place where you can come to and say, nobody else was going to understand this, but I knew you all would. And of course, thank you for your support of Craftlit. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.